Hi everybody, welcome to the Innovate for Cities conference. My name is Madison Miller and I'm a Darug woman and researcher at the University of Melbourne. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I join you, located on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country in what we now call Melbourne. I pay my respects to their elders, ancestors and their lands and I recognise that their sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to acknowledge that the Innovate for Cities conference will be taking place all over the world as participants tune in from their respective lands, which may be traditional territories of many Indigenous peoples. As the conference MC, I am here to welcome our audience before each plenary session and to help you navigate your way through our huge program. I encourage you to look into the many spaces on the online platform, including the cinema, or the mayoral receptions, and to contact the help desk if you have any questions or need assistance over the next 5 days. Before I hand over to our hosts of our second plenary, I want to acknowledge the conference organisers and hosts of this Innovate for Cities conference, the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy and UN Habitat, and to our co-sponsor, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'd also like to recognise our partners, Resilience First, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Melbourne Centre for Cities, UNESCAP, UNEP, UNDRR, Cities Alliance, Coalition for Urban Transitions, Urban Sustainability Directors Network, UCCRN, World Bank, World Resources Institute, Future Earth, Student Energy, UNU, CDP, ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, OECD, IIED, Planners for Climate Action, Metropolis and Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge our regional curator teams and our 500 presenters across our almost 200 sessions who have ensured that this global conference features the intersection of cities and climate science with true local context, providing an important opportunity to review the gaps in knowledge and priority themes uncovered in the Global Research Action Agenda on Cities and Climate Change. The GRAA is the key outcome of the first Cities and Climate Change Science Conference in Edmonton in 2018. Our sessions throughout the conference have responded to the themes within this agenda. Our Science and Innovation Steering Committee, who have overseen this conference's objectives and proceedings, will be working with our writers and rapporteur team to review and update the GRAA as a key output of this conference. And importantly, the conference and its outputs will feed key messages into the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26. If you did use the GRAA after the Edmonton conference, please do visit and complete a survey in the Knowledge Centre so we can hear how and where you used it. In the design of the conference, we have concentrated our efforts to include both the wide range of themes and wide range of voices engaged in innovation and transformation throughout the different sessions. However, we acknowledge that certain issues or voices might not always be represented. For example, this could be the social justice aspect, which is not often prioritised by certain sectors. Therefore, we encourage you to include your reflections in your session comments. Please feel free to incorporate these thoughts on the discussions board and the survey, which can be found in the Knowledge Centre. If you have any technical questions throughout the conference, please head to the Help Centre located at the bottom of the homepage. Now, just before we welcome our wonderful hosts for the next session, I'd like to take the opportunity to meet the conference illustrator, Desiree. She and Lila will be capturing our plenary discussions visually. Eve, could we spotlight Desiree? We'll be able to keep track of Desiree's progress throughout the session, and we will check out her work at the end. So now I'd like to warmly welcome to the virtual stage the moderators for this second plenary, Dr. Kathy Oak, Associate Director, Enterprise and Impact at Melbourne's Centre for Cities at the University of Melbourne, and Bernard Barth, Acting Program Coordinator for Climate Change and Urban Environment at UN Habitat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maddie. Great MC that we have in our conference, and a great session that we have lined up here, Plenary 2. It's great pleasure to co-host with Bernard this topic of adaptation and resilience as integrated approaches to tackling climate change. Before I begin, I too acknowledge that I'm joining from the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri land, the members of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders, both past and present as well. So, as we've heard a bit about this Global Research Action Agenda, and through these plenary sessions, we are building on the different themes. And it was a very important document coming out of the 2018 conference. And as we've heard, we're looking to revise, refresh, get a better understanding or an understanding of what gaps remain and where the innovation has come in the last couple of years. And in the GRA, while research and innovation needs and gaps were linked to urban planning and design, as well as built and blue-green infrastructure, city climate action plans still focus mainly on mitigation and adaptation interventions. Over to you, Bernard.
Thank you, Kathy. The COVID-19 pandemic caused a global shock effect that also widened the debate on climate strategies that also take into account risk and resilience much more broadly. City climate action plans are increasingly aligned with long-term city visions and budgeting, while urban form and infrastructure have proven to be powerful drivers for adaptation and resilience. Measures as well as frameworks for green recovery approaches. So in order to help us take stock and refine and adapt the Global Research Action Agenda, so often mentioned, we want to explore how both science and implementation on these topics have evolved over the past years and which challenges remain or have newly emerged. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Undersecretary Marilyn Pinto, the Undersecretary for Human Settlements and Urban Development and Boroughs of the Republic of the Philippines. Undersecretary Pinto is a lawyer and certified public accountant and has many years of public service behind her, and most of those, in fact, with the Commission on Human Rights, which I think bodes well for the adaptation topic today. In 2019, she was appointed Commissioner of the Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board. She led the transition to the new Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development, where she is now Undersecretary as well as Deputy Secretary of the department. Undersecretary Pinto, the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development and its institutional predecessors have taken on climate change for quite some time. For example, the National Urban Development and Housing Framework of the Philippines addresses climate change very comprehensively and strategically, and so do the guidelines for the comprehensive land use plans that are implemented by the local government units. Undersecretary, we look forward to the perspective of how national governments can catalyze, facilitate, and support science-based and integrated climate actions at the city level. I believe your presentation will highlight the opportunities and challenges faced by the Urban Ministry in supporting and working with cities in their development and implementation of transformative climate change, adaptation, and resilience plans. Undersecretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bernard. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to present our agency initiatives and learnings in tackling climate adaptation and resilience in an integrated manner. I am proud to be part of this session, and I'm looking forward to learn as well in our exchange. Allow me first to give a background of our department or ministry, if I may say. The Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development, or the SUD, was created by a national law, Republic Act 11201. We are the sole and main planning and policy making, regulatory, program coordination, and performance monitoring entity for all housing, human settlement, and urban development. We are also responsible for the development and adoption of a national strategy to ensure the alignment of policies, programs, and projects of all its attached agencies. Our mandate, our mandate also covers formulation of policy frameworks for resilient housing and human settlements as basis for post-disaster housing and resiliency planning, research and development, extension, monitoring, and evaluation of programs, projects, and activities to protect vulnerable communities from adverse effects of climate change and disasters as mentioned in Section 5 of the DSUD law, among its other relevant sections. The department has 5 attached agencies. Together with its attached agencies, the department does financing, production, and adjudication. As you see on the slide, the department issues policies, formulate programs, and initiatives to operationalize its mandates. The NUDHF serves as the country's national urban policy, which integrated climate change considerations into the principles, strategies, objectives, and action areas. Given the demand and complexity of Philippines' planning process, one main lesson we learned is that the planning environment, and by considering the multiple hazards, requires a systems approach. Otherwise, climate actions will not be sustainable. When we say systems approach, we integrate science, people, institutions, timelines, spatial elements, and financing. Our NUDHF has been operationalized into a 20-year roadmap through the National Housing and Urban Development Sector 2040 that spans the different banner programs. The department's banner programs are targeted catalytic interventions that aim to rethink and restructure the process of designing and developing human settlements, ranging from settlements development, urban infrastructure, design, policy, and governance. They act as levers and stimulants for further actions towards sustainable urban development and showcase the vision of the department through a holistic, innovative, and integrated approach. The programs are presented under the banner statement, Sustainable Housing in Well-Planned Communities for Every Filipino Family. This mirrors the sector's plan's long-term vision while focusing on priority programs for implementation, especially in the short and medium terms, demonstrating tangible results and reflective of the collaborative nature of work in the urban development and human settlement sector through creating spaces, transforming spaces into communities, making communities accessible and affordable, and empowering communities. Shown in the screen are the existing guidelines for CLUP formulation, updating with consideration of the Climate Change Act and Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act. The predecessor of the department, which is the HLURB, has already conducted advocacy or orientation activities, established mechanisms at the regional and the local levels. Our planners regularly conduct seminar workshops on the application of the new guidelines for city municipal planning teams through cluster and modular approach. The enhanced CLUP guidebook series provided the need to mainstream climate change in local land use policy and development strategies and strengthening disaster risk reduction and management. It also paved the way to have an all-inclusive physical plan by integrating our coastal and forest lands in city municipal land use plans. At present, there are two main guides of local planners. The local planners can use in mainstreaming CCA DDR into the CLUP. Other guides can also be used as references since the two documents approved by the HLURB follows international frameworks set by UNISDR and IPCC. Volume 2, together with the other guidebooks, were developed to enhance and update the 2006 guidebook to include the CCA, DRR, as well as other thematic areas such as coastal, forest, and biodiversity. The elements of the enhanced CLUP guidelines focused as an important factor the science-based approach that also considers the adoption of the ridge to reef approach as the framework for planning, inclusion of ecosystems, analysis and planning, forest, coastal, biodiversity, and special areas like ancestral domain, cultural heritage, green growth, and urban design. Moving forward, we want to show that the SUD is also involved in multi-level governance for climate resilience, such as the climate change and DRR cabinet cluster. We are also involved in aligning housing and urban development policies to support the country's NDC and the National Climate Action Plan and the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan. The department provides technical support to the local government units through the comprehensive land use plan, which is an entry point for adaptation and resilience. The CLUP is a document embodying specific proposals for guiding and regulating the growth and or development of a city or municipality. It is a long-term plan document, and it is also a tool for managing land and natural resources at the local level. As of now, across the country, there are 606 out of 1,634 local government units with updated CLUPs that integrated the CDRA, while we have 861 LGUs currently updating and or reviewing their CLUPs. As a conclusion, let me share with you some of the challenges, lessons learned, and way forward, namely the need to improve the application of climate science and technology for evidence-based in policy development and practice at all levels. There is also a need to unlock financing to support climate resilient shelter and urban design projects. The pandemic and public health need to be enhanced in policies. Green recovery provides a vast opportunity to marry climate targets and economic rebound. And there is in the field of providing incentives or awards to local government units with notable performance on implementing economic resilient human settlement programs. So thank you very much, everyone. That ends my presentation.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary Pinto. And I think your presentation was very clear in terms of policy development, in terms of rolling this out to the cities through the comprehensive land use planning process and the engagement through the multi-level governance system that you have described. So thank you very much for that. And I hand over to Kathy.
Well, thank you, Bernard. I would now like to introduce our next two speakers to provide two further interventions for our panel to respond to. We have Winston Chow, who's an Associate Professor of Science, Technology and Society at the Singapore Management University, and Nikki Franciscaki, who is the Professor of Urban Sustainability Transitions at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne. I'm going to first go to Winston. You've got a bit of a challenge here. You've been given 5 minutes to present the most recent IPCC Working Group 1 findings, and in particular, the links to cities and the extra efforts that are needed to remain in line with the 1.5 scenario. And then Nikki, you're going to respond briefly on why cities are uniquely positioned to drive change and how urban transitions could help to support the nationally determined contributions. And we heard from the Undersecretary on this matter as well. I know that you're going to refer to some of the urban nature gaps that have been effectively picked up on since Edmonton and which remain as priorities to address in the next couple of years. So I propose, Winston, you'll speak first, and then Nikki, feel free to then get your slides ready, and then we'll head over to our panel to respond to the three presentations we've heard already this morning, or this afternoon, whichever time zone you're in. First to Winston, please.
Thank you, Kathy. Challenge accepted. So I'll try my best to present what has been done, what was released in August by the Working Group 1 authors of the IPCC 6 assessment report. I have three key takeaways in my intervention. The first is that the coverage of urban aspects in climate change in AR6, the 6 assessment report, has been much improved compared to what took place in the 5th assessment report in 2013 and 2014. There was no real engagement with the science previously, but now I'm glad to see that a lot of very good observational and modeling work that has taken place in cities is fairly reflected in the 6th assessment report. I would like to share my screen and showcase this regional fact sheet that was developed to highlight the urban aspects as considered a region of how urban areas have affected climate change. There's a lot of detail on the past, present, and also future trends of how cities can be exposed to various climate impacts, such as from heat and as well as from the water cycle, with too much water or too little water in that sense. There's also really good information about aspects of air pollution, and a very good highlight at the bottom of the fact sheet that relates to the urban heat island phenomenon, which many urban policymakers have to tackle with the inadvertent aspects of development, resulting in very high local warming. So there's another aspect here of interest that comes out a lot in the Working Group 1 report, is that how cities develop and are exposed to aspects of air pollution, which is a key hazard and a key driver of mortality of a lot of urban residents throughout the world. The second takeaway that I want people to understand is that the geography of where cities are located matters tremendously. First, I would like to highlight this figure here, which indicates the rate of warming that has been measured in cities of particular regions around the world. Notice that for areas with a high degree of urban warming relative to regional or global climate warming, occurring in areas that have undergone rapid urbanization since the middle of the 20th century until today, primarily in East and South Asia, where I'm from, in Singapore, for instance, although it's not reflected in the figure there, we've seen an increase of 1.8 degrees Celsius from the middle of the 20th century until today. So it's higher than the average or the mean figure that is depicted there. So it gives you the importance of not just considering the regional or global warming that has affected cities, but also the local warming primarily from the heat island that adds to the exposure of urban residents that people have to consider. The second is that if we move down to the second page of the fact sheet, is that coastal cities not only will have to deal with issues of the heat island or from regional heat or from air pollution as well, but also issues pertaining to sea level rise and the flooding that is associated with being exposed to higher sea levels that is in the pipeline. And this is something that we will consider a lot in the forthcoming Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 reports that deal with impacts, adaptation, vulnerability, as well as for mitigation and sustainable development, respectively. The third takeaway, I guess, if I could stop sharing my screen, is that while the Working Group 1 reports highlight the exposure element tremendously that cities face in the future, it doesn't speak a lot about the agency and the transformative potential that people living in cities have. While urban areas cover between 3 to 4% of the planet's surface, by the middle of the century, about 65 to 70% of people will be living in cities. Also, depending on which reference you look into, between 60 to 70% of associated global emissions are directly related from urban activities and urban consumption. This relates a lot, respectively, to the adaptation potential and the resilience potential that I think this conference speaks directly to. And I will conclude by saying that if we need to keep to that 1.5 degrees C threshold that governments agreed to in 2015, it's not just people living in cities that have to tackle this issue. It's the public sector and the private sector that have to also work together in an integrative fashion. We have to pull in the same direction sooner rather than later. And I think this panel that will speak directly to that. And I look forward to hearing what my fellow panelists will say in the context of the high degree of exposure that we urbanites are facing now. All right. Thank you very much. Back to you, Kathy.
Oh, thank you, Winston. I'm just going to handball straight across to Nikki to add to that. But thank you very much for that succinct and a succinct summary of Working Group 1 and where to next. So Nikki, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers, and time is up for me to make my almost 5 minutes intervention. As Kathy Oak already introduced, my presentation is going to look on two interconnected aspects: on the role of cities as transformative agents for achieving future climate resilience, and also of what are the urban transitions that can drive and can empower this role, but also the ones that we need to take into consideration exactly for a more transformative climate action for the future. I want to start my presentation by saying that I see cities being in the eye of the transition, not only on the driving seat, but also in the midst of it. Before diving into it, I want to also pay my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Islander people of Australia and hope that the path towards reconciliation continues to be shared and embraced. Straightforward to the first point. Since 2018, I think a lot of research, but also a lot of urban policy and practice have shown that cities are major actors in facilitating sustainability transitions to urban resilience. In a very recent published article together with Australian colleagues, we noticed and we also brought forward these arguments by saying what needs to be safeguarded in holding the ground for cities as driving actors in this transformative process. We came with 5 critical messages that they build from what we know to work, but also what we need to safeguard for the future. We do need systems approaches to be embedded in urban planning, but to also foreground integrative climate action. We need to look on systemic solutions on climate innovations in cities, such as nature-based solutions, that they not only confront, but also transform our relationship between human nature at present and in the future. We know that a lot of cities embarked into a learning, but also learning by doing pathway with urban resilience. Sees the 100 Resilient Cities Network with Rockefeller and all the evolving networks and planning governance experiments since then. But what we need to see in the future, and what we have seen being very effective, is when these resilience principles are mainstreamed in the design and the management of nature-based solutions and climate infrastructure in cities. Experimentation has been argued a lot, not only now, not only 2018, but at least the past 10 to 15 years, as a way forward of looking on a new paradigm of urbanism, talking about climate urbanism, resilient urbanism, and now renaturing urbanism. What cities have showcased is how important it is, what are the valuable lessons for planning, policy, and governance, and how new paradigms of research like transdisciplinarity can strengthen and extend this. And of course, taking and strengthening the message that came from the IUCN Congress, but also from lots of discussions and progress in policy, practice, and science, we look on the important role to co-produce knowledge with indigenous people and with indigenous communities. But even though this is very important and recognized, we need definitely to look closer at cities and how they perform and what we can learn in terms of governance innovations that they can support achieving the national contributions. 3 messages here, if I can be also very thought-provoking. The first is to stop looking on how to revitalize and renew existing path dependency institutions. I think this is a very strong message of looking what innovation happens in the ground and how to progress and strengthen that. Look on intermediaries and boundary flexing actors. These are the ones that they have been shaping and transforming within and across sectors. So if we are to look on them, is how we learn how institutional transitions are happening and how cities have been really the places where flexible institutions have been trialed, and they have also worked into bringing new topics in the agenda and strengthening climate action and giving it even a more empowered position in policy agendas. The second aspect is to look closely of who drives the change within cities themselves. Together with Kathy Oak, we have frequent discussions about the knowledge entrepreneurs. Who are they, how they operate, and also how they become more than just advocacy actors. They connect, they scale out, and they also move beyond the performative role of science. So we need to look on the knowledge transitions that are happening with cities being really driving actors, transformative agencies in this. The third aspect is to look on the digital transformations and the digital transitions in the making. All the cities are building databases. They use a lot of new means and new technologies. They have established or are establishing smart cities approaches, but how this can inform and further strengthen the climate action, not to go against it. And it all lies in the question, how can we empower, upskill, and also transform urban planning to take and capitalize on this opportunity of data-driven transformations in cities? Where next? What can be our priorities to address in the next years? 6 messages interconnected, and of course, for the panel to consider and reflect. First, we need to look on mainstreaming of systemic solutions like nature-based solutions, not to be the outcome, but rather the process to achieve climate resilient cities in the future. It's very frequently that we look so much into framing, reframing, reshaping the target. But when we talk about mainstreaming, it is about ensuring that we have inclusive, innovative, and adaptive transitions to achieve this. The second point is we pay a lot of attention in innovation and in creating institutional space, mental space, knowledge space for the new. we need also to put equal effort in destabilizing blocking regimes, in divesting from structures that are actually don't create enough space for this takeoff of climate solutions, of climate science and climate policy. So as far as we are all committed to a bold target, we need in the future to commit and to put a lot of effort in bolder implementation on the grounds. The third aspect is that cities and city regions are to lead the way to achieve the Paris targets and also the SDGs. But for doing this and creating momentum and creating a positive path dependency, we need to regulatory and financially equip our cities to actually do it. Not only creating the narrative space and the leadership space for it, but also equip them to progress it. From recent research we have been doing on what is needed to mainstream nature-based solutions for urban climate resilience, I want to also connect these messages to the bigger picture. First steps, or you might say stepping stones for such a bold proposition are outlined here. First is about strengthening the evidence base, connect the in-depth, contextual, culturally sensitive and empowering local knowledge on local case studies and examples with a synthesis at a global level. IPCC, IPBES, UNEP are already bodies at a global scale that do this. However, we also need, as a science policy community, to further strengthen the evidence base and work in a coordinated fashion for this. The second is to bridge disciplinary silos in order to improve planning and governance. And this does not only point the finger between how science and policy collaborate, but also within science and community, these relationships are being built, maintained, and stewarded over the future. Last, and that's my last message, is another important stepping stone is how do we do co-production of knowledge? How do we open up and share knowledge globally? And what the pandemic is showing that there are ways to make our science and our practice more inclusive, how we can democratize it, but at the same time, we need to keep asking the question, how these processes can become more inclusive, looking on social justice, environmental justice, but also epistemological justice to it. And with this, I want to close and thank you very much and pass the baton back to Kathy Oak.
Oh, thank you, Nikki. And I'm now going to, I could respond to all of those points, but rather let's go to our stellar panelists to do that instead. And so Bernard, over to you to introduce our responding panel.
Yes, thank you very much, Kathy. So we have a panel of 4 participants. I will just very briefly introduce them and then kick off the conversation with a quick question. So we have Councillor Jess Miller of the City of Sydney, a stellar advocate for environmental issues. We have Aaron Hawkins, the Lord Mayor of the city of Dunedin in New Zealand. We have Shumei Bai, a distinguished professor of urban environment and human ecology from the Australian National University. And we have Mitali Nikor, economist and founder of Nikor Associates, to cover local government as well as academia and the private sector. To start, Jess, there is no lack of effort and good practices when it comes to adaptation, but implementation at scale does most of the time, or at least often, not follow. Why is that? What are the missing links? How can we address those?
It's such a huge question, and thanks for having me, and really great launching off presentations by the prior speakers, and just sort of picking up on some of those key thematics. I think there's sometimes a a temptation when we talk about trying to achieve impact at scale to replicate a process that works in one context with the expectation that it's just going to work in all of the contexts. And I think that idea is really fundamentally flawed, especially within, the Australian context, where we have such an interesting set of relationships between local government and local actors, state actors and federal actors, and one would argue a real disconnection between those various players on issues of policy. And I think one of the things that I'm sort of beginning to recognise, both as a decision maker and both as a practitioner within this space, is that in order to solve these problems, we really have to start to fundamentally rethink structures and relationships that we have. So if we're trying to replicate systems at scale and we're replicating the wrong system or the wrong process, the outcomes that we're going to get are not going to work. So I think it's most recently it's been through working with Indigenous practitioners and ecologists that I'm really, really rethinking and understanding how critically important it is to develop relationships with human beings, to understand what are their fears, to understand what their aspirations are, and then also understand what it is that makes them feel a sense of trust and a sense of optimism in terms of what you're proposing. That's really, really critical going kind of back into decision-making mode. You shortly learn that even when you're trying to push through a very ambitious climate policy, transport policy, air pollution policy, planning policy, if you haven't done the groundwork to communicate and develop the relationships with the community onto which you're hoping to implement these new policies, inevitably they will fall down. A really good example of that is, throughout the pandemic, we were able, as the City of Sydney, to get some funding from the state government after a long fight to install some pop-up cycleways. It was a very fast-tracked process of doing this. These cycleways literally popped up overnight. And because we hadn't undergone the usual process of, knocking on people's doors, explaining the benefits of cycling, co-designing this infrastructure, a lot of this infrastructure was met with real resistance. And it caused a big, distracting, prolonged fight that led to an outcome that probably wasn't what we were looking for. So I think, drawing on some of what's been said, there are probably a few themes that I think are worthy of investigating further and understanding and thinking of when we're looking at applying research, policy, innovation, and that is, have we created enough time and space to really get to know people and to really understand them in a thoughtful way? Are we imposing ideas from one place onto another without really considering the context? And how, through the development of these relationships over time, can we build the trust that then kind of softly and gently entices people to begin to imagine and see the possibilities of change and not be afraid of it? And I think that if we can nail that piece of the puzzle, and for the love of God, stop calling human beings customers or clients, that would be really fantastic. So I think I'll leave it there and look forward to see what other people think.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And I hand over to our next local government speaker, Mayor Hawkins.
Kia ora koutou, ka mi nui ki koutou, kia ora, acknowledging the people of Kaitahu, Kati Mamoi and Waitaha, who are the mana whenua or First Nations of where I stand here in Otapoti, Dunedin, and also the original owners of the land, wherever you out there on the internet are standing. And apologies for the spectacular lighting available to us in my home office. And we do that as a mark of respect, but I think in this context it's important also because we know that Indigenous knowledge has a lot to offer the fight for climate action, and that around the world often it is our First Nations people who have had played the smallest part in creating the problem, but are at the pointiest end of dealing with it. And I wanted to talk briefly just on one issue, and I'm pleased that Jess brought up tactical urbanism, and I think that's a really interesting tension between the principles of co-design and getting community support versus the urgency under which we are acting, and certainly there are examples here where we were responding to the need for people to be able to physically, socially distance in a pandemic environment. You can't really go door knocking in an environment where people aren't able to leave their house. It was a tricky situation. But transport, I want to cover off briefly. In terms of the zero carbon transition, our biggest challenge is also our biggest opportunity, is also our biggest frustration. So transport makes up roughly half of our city's carbon footprint, and it is both one of the easiest problems we have to solve because in so many cases the alternatives are viable and already exist. We don't have to invent our way out of it in the way that we do dealing with methane or other gases, but it's also one of the hardest things for us to solve because we're fighting a culture war over every single car parking space in our urban environment. And because the backlash to tactical urbanism and temporary interventions is so vile and toxic that our staff and officers are increasingly reluctant to suggest going down that path, and politicians obviously are even more risk averse because they care about getting re-elected. And so that's really problematic. And in our context, we're not a big city. We've got a population of about 130,000 people, but it is growing for the first time in decades, which means that we have more people using our transport network and more people on the roads. And so we're seeing increasing congestion in our transport network. But people will argue that that's because we've given marginally more space to try and keep cyclists alive, not the fact that we've got hundreds, if not thousands, more vehicles on the road. And, you know, when all you have known as privilege, equity feels like oppression. The question was also put to us, what is the impact of, what impact has COVID had on this? And in this example, the impacts of COVID, of the pandemic, are both practical and political. So roughly half the funding for our transport network comes from a nationwide funding agency that generate their money from fuel tax. So with lockdowns and with people working from home, we have fewer people that are driving around, and so they're not buying as much petrol, and so they're not generating as much tax revenue, and so there's less money to put into public transport and active transport and the transport network more generally. I mean, that's a higher level macro problem in that for every person that we have driving an electric vehicle or biking to work or using public transport, that reduces the amount of money that we have to reinvest it more in that. And so the federal government have a bigger picture macro question to deal with in terms of how transport is financed. But politically, the challenge is similar but different. So the global uncertainty has been great for elected members who come from a small government worldview, who want to cut taxes and who are happy to use people who are genuinely doing it tough in the current situation. No one is arguing that people aren't doing it hard, but you know, you have small government libertarians using those people who are doing it tough, that they weirdly never seem to support us supporting in other contexts, but using that as justification for slashing budgets and for cutting programs that we know are urgently needed, whether it's dealing with the climate crisis or urban biodiversity outcomes, or all of these other things that become somehow framed as luxury items and non-essential work that we are doing in local government. And we've so far resisted that politically where we are, which is great, but over the years to come, that won't get any easier. And I think it's going to be important to try and hold the line to the just transition. We know that climate change, as has been mentioned, is the greatest social justice issue that we are currently dealing with, and we need to make sure that the solutions don't exacerbate the existing inequalities that we have in our community. And that's hard, because often the things that people understand are things like using pricing mechanisms to drive behavior change, but we know that that is fundamentally regressive and causes other problems further down the line. But it's a great opportunity that we have, and my heart says we'll take it, and my head says we won't. But we have to keep pushing to make the best of the situation that we find ourselves in, to try and create a better society for our communities. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks for really outlining the challenges that local governments face. With that, I would like to hand over to Shumei. You have engaged in a very broad field of research on urban issues. How can we best address global, complex, and intricately linked societal challenges? And we've heard of many of those, including climate change, or climate change as an entry point. How do scientists loop in a systems perspective, and how can local policymakers still decide on what short and long-term priorities are, maybe also directly linking to our previous two panelists? Over to you, Shumei.
Thank you so much, Bernard. And I would also like to say that it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and also thanks for the three excellent interventions and previous discussions. And I would also like to start by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional land I'm joining now, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. So coming to your first question, how can we best address these globally complex and intricately linked challenges, among which climate change is one? I think we must really acknowledge that the interlinkages between climate change and other environmental issues, as well as with other non-environmental societal challenges. And we know that climate change is just one aspect within many of these interlinked complex challenges. And there are several elements in saying this. So here I would like to just raise two examples. For example, we really need to look beyond the current cities and put the climate change challenges we are facing now in the context of rapid urbanization. So we know that by 2050, more than 2 billion people will be added to cities, and about 90% of them to cities in the global south. So we really need to reconsider how to build these cities and provide necessary infrastructure to these new urban residents, as building these stocks, these infrastructure stocks in cities will really require trillions of dollars of investment, and it entails large carbon consequences. And also this infrastructure must withstand the exacerbating climate hazards and disasters that are expected to be increased, as pointed out by Winston just now. And in a short paper we did in the running up for the 2018 Edmonton conference, which is predecessor of this conference on cities and climate change, which were published in Nature then, we calculated that in order to provide the same level of built infrastructure service to current and future developing country cities, and if we do that with traditional technology, it will entail about 226 gigaton of CO2 by 2050. And this is about 1/3 of remaining carbon budget, or even less, if we are to achieve the Paris Agreement. And it's also important that climate change policy interventions shouldn't really be achieved at the expense of other challenges. And policy design aiming at, for example, reducing transportation energy through densification need really to consider what that actually means for urban green and associated biodiversity and ecosystem services. And our recent paper really shows actually every bit of urban green counts towards reducing the urban heat island and help lower the temperature during extreme heat events, which also highlighted by Winston just previously. So this urban heat island and urban extreme heat event is expected to exacerbate with climate change and impact on somewhere between 1 to 3 billion population, depending on which study you're looking at. And the benefit of having this urban green and nature-based solutions in cities, as mentioned by Nikki, really these benefits in having this infrastructure, the benefit in turn can really help reduce the demand for air conditioning and in turn really lower the energy demand. So coming back to your second question on how the scientists can look in the systematic approach, I would really like to say that integrative systems thinking and approach is really important in both science and practice, again, as highlighted by previous speakers. And fortunately, it is really increasingly adopted by scientists across the traditional disciplinary or even domain divide. One of such example is the first ever joint workshop between IPCC and IPBES, two main intergovernmental bodies, which was held for the first time about a year ago. And the scientific outcome of which was published June this year. And the report really finds that climate change mitigation, adaptation, and biodiversity conservation, they are really mutually supporting kind of goals. And their achievements is essential for sustainability, sustainability, as well as equitably providing the benefit to people. And they really call for an integrated biodiversity, climate, society approach, BCS approach, they call it in short, and including transformative governance in order to achieve those. And the report is also highlighting many different types and examples of this kind of interlinkages. And it is openly available on the internet. So if interested, please take a look. And also, I think in practice, this could really mean finding the leverage point that addresses multiple challenges is really essential. So addressing other pressing challenges can also have mitigation and adaptation co-benefits. And fortunately, science has really been providing increasing evidence on that. For example, the policy measures designed for air pollution abatement, which is a serious problem in many Asian cities, for example, they can often include enhancing industrial energy use efficiency or switching fuel from coal to less polluting natural gas, or even to renewable solar and wind energies, both of which can have greatly effective for climate change mitigation. And another such example is demand-side solution. In an upcoming paper, which is coming in Nature Climate Change. By the way, we just heard the final acceptance of the paper this morning. The paper is led by Felix Krutzig in Mercator Research Institute in Germany. And the co-authors have found that we have actually shown that the demand-side solutions to climate change, including strategies of shifting, avoiding, and improving those services, have very high potential to reduce carbon emissions while maintaining very high level of human well-being. So in summary, I would really re-emphasize that integrative systems thinking and approach is critically important in both science and practices. And fortunately, on both of these domains, progresses are being made towards it. I hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Shmeh. And I then invite Mitali to speak more from a private sector perspective. How did climate change impact the private sector agendas and investment plans over the last years? Does adaptation and resilience thinking create new value or business models, of course, supporting local government action and urban climate adaptation action more broadly?
Thank you so much, and good morning. I'm based in India at this point, so it is morning for me, and it's lovely to be invited here to interact with all of you. Thank you so much for the invite, and very nice to meet you finally, Kathy, after all the conversations we've had. So, just to lay out a few of these points, it's been very interesting to listen to everyone. But this is really the first time in this discussion that we're talking about the private sector. And it's interesting that, we come to the private sector last when it comes to adaptation and actually taking the solutions and the technology to the final consumer, it's actually the private sector which plays much of that role and much of the implementation role. And what has been interesting, I've been advising the World Bank, ADB, and also a few UN agencies in my career so far. And what we've seen so far is that the pricing of the technology is something that we can deal with from a subsidization perspective. But what we really need to support the private sector with is a change in ideology and planning. And that is something that we're now starting to see. So in the last few years, Bernard, to sort of come back to your question, we've seen a huge amount of increase in opportunities come across, especially, I would say, infrastructure sectors. So if we look at renewable energy, that's sort of come up as one big pillar, really, of decarbonization efforts, where the private sector has really taken the lead, whether it comes to solar, whether it comes to wind energy, whether it comes to biomass energy. And we're seeing this not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And one example I'd really like to bring up front is of a firm called Renew Power, which is actually an India-based firm, which was set up with initial financing from the World Bank and the ADB, but has now become a profitable entity and has set up almost 10 gigawatts of solar power in India, and is not only powering large solar plants, but actually going into rural areas and also setting up solar panels and smaller solar installations for rural electrification. So it's truly an example of inclusive provision of energy across the board, not only through large infrastructure, but also distributed independent power production systems. Then on top of that, on top of the electrification agenda, we have the second big pillar of clean transport. And within clean transport, I think today companies have come together, large automakers have come together to really push the agenda on electric vehicles. We know that battery storage prices are falling. We know that there is immense innovation in the electric vehicle space, not only through one or two companies like Tesla at the global stage, but also when we look at developing countries putting down the policy frameworks required, investing in charging infrastructure to actually make electric vehicles a reality. Again, I'd come back to the example of India here, where we have now instituted a national policy for electric vehicle rollout. And car companies are actually responding by even manufacturing in the developing country context. So, we need more of that. We need to have, investment, private investment coming into clean transport, not only the passenger transport, but also looking at freight transport, because that's where we're generating the most amount of carbon emissions. And that is happening again. We are seeing a move towards light rail. We are seeing a move towards, light duty vehicles. But the problem with many of these, and why there's a kind of resistance to sort of adopt these more broadly, is because of the cost of production. And that's where I feel that public-private partnerships have a huge role to play, because we do have private investment coming in and we do have private innovation coming in, but maybe there is a certain amount of subsidies and PPP models that can be explored to increase the preponderance and uptake of these technologies. The third big pillar is really around decarbonization in the energy and resource intensive manufacturing processes. So whether it's the coal industries, the mining industries. Now here, the application of circular economic principles is really how we can clean the manufacturing processes. And really the simple thing is, within about 20 to 30 years, we're already starting to see this happen. In a recent survey that Deloitte conducted, they found that out of the 112 companies that they surveyed, nearly 95% had a plan in place to reduce emissions by almost 30% by 2050. Now, in order to expedite that, again, the subsidies model, the model of public-private partnerships, the model of giving incentives is something, financial incentives that can work. But also saying that, look, the end product, the waste that you're generating, it can actually be reused into creating something, a new product, and setting up new marketplaces. So I think that's where the linkages between the private sector and the scientific community, as Shuma, sort of laid out in her address, make a huge difference, because as the private sector becomes more aware of how to apply these solutions in their production processes, they would be more than willing to. I can share a personal anecdote here. I have been doing a lot of work with small and medium enterprises in rural areas in India. And while they're part of global value chains, their value addition and actual profitability is hit by COVID, and it's very, very low. And a lot of them who were complying with pollution and emission norms in the manufacturing sector now find it very, very costly to do so. So in such a situation during COVID, as we're coming out of COVID, what we really need is to support these industries transition and invest in more climate resilient, clean manufacturing processes, and actually see that emissions reduction. And that's how the value creation can take place in a synergistic manner. Because at this point, the value addition for business, the case is clear. They will have cost savings if there are subsidies and policies in place for that. But they also see the value of investing, at least in the long term, in clean technologies. But we just need that one last push to take them over the line. Back to you, Bernard.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that. And I hand over to Kathy.
Indeed, goodness, so many great responses to Nikki and Winston and our Undersecretary's initial presentations. We could be here for a while, but luckily, and I think a lot of you have been observing it on the screen, we're in the back end. I'm not sure exactly what you're seeing, but you've been looking at Desiree, our fabulous illustrator, has been capturing each of our speakers in on her board. And so I'm hoping we can just have a quick display of the whole board. I know she was focusing in on each of your points as you were speaking, which is excellent. So thank you, Desiree, and we look forward to seeing the end result on a page of this very wide-ranging conversation. But so thank you, Desiree, for all of that work, and hopefully it's being put on the screen right now. Okay, so now we're going to conclude this session. We've got about 20 minutes to go, and so I'm going to actually ask Nikki and Winston first. You have a minute or two to pick up on one mark or an overall action or even a challenge. I think we heard Nikali challenge you all at the end there. So please pick up on something and provide a response, and then we'll let our panel to also pick up on what the fellow speakers have presented in this wide-ranging approach on integration and climate resilience and adaptation in our cities. So how about we go to you, Nikki, first, and then we'll let Winston come in.
Thank you. So thank you all for amazing comments. Of course, makes it extraordinarily difficult to find the overarching and transversal aspect. But what I want to bring forward is this need to think of transformative governance approaches and the science and the practice to bring these transformations forward. And for this, we need, let's say, we need scientists to progress to more co-creation, co-production, modes of knowledge, transdisciplinary and integrative frameworks. We do need to explore new modes of collaboration with industry, with sustainable SMEs, and pioneering clean tech and net zero companies. But also we always need to point to the importance of governments as creating the enabling spaces with transformative innovation policy and transformative climate policy to make and legitimize these new relationships and collaborations. So for transformative climate action, we do need a full round of transformations to come together. And up to Winston.
Thanks, Nikki. First, I'd like to thank Jess, Mayor Hawkins, Yume, and Mitali. I've learned so much from your interventions. Thank you genuinely. It's a pleasure listening to you. I'll try and make my intervention brief. I'll focus using the topic of the risks that we face from climate change, the direct risks, but also the compounding risks, especially with COVID, like what Mayor Hawkins pointed out that he's facing in Dunedin, and the cascading risks that will happen, the impacts that will extend beyond cities with global supply chains and with other aspects that go beyond the territorial boundaries of what we consider to be urban. Some great points I would like to echo as well. Jess pointed out that communication is essential, and I tell my students that it's easy to learn about climate change, but it's bloody difficult to communicate how risky these things are. And it's an art, and I echo that point that Jess made, that it's difficult to do so and not call important stakeholders as consumers. I like that point there. The inequalities that Mayor Hawkins pointed out is something essential. We can't tackle this without looking into the vulnerable segments of society and how to deal with those inequalities at the same time. And this leads very nicely to Siume's very important point that systems analysis and allows for the assessment of how co-benefits from adaptation and from transformative actions that deal and enhance resilience is essential. And it provides us with that key to reducing the said direct, compounding and cascading risks that urban areas will face. And lastly, Mitali's point, yes, the private sector is essential. We can't consider that to be, last but not least. We should view them as equal partners together with people and with the public sector as well. And the momentum that the private sector has been displaying, after Paris towards, towards the goal of keeping to 1.5 degrees Celsius is important, and it will drive a lot of action together with governments, with practitioners, and with people. So that's all I have to say. And back to you, Kathy.
It's all a bit of a handballing exercise. No, I'm going to now hand back to Bernard, who will receive remarks from the panel. We're responding to each other really well. So Bernard, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Kathy. And of course, we have really very limited time left. So I would like to encourage all the panel members to use adaptation at least as an entry point. That is the theme of the panel. Of course, I think we have made it very clear that we are looking at the interconnections, the co-benefits, but just as an entry point, and also focus on concrete examples, concrete needs. Maybe to start, Shumei, looking at the systems perspective, can you give us a specific innovation also that really helps to accelerate adaptation given all the challenges that we've heard?
Thank you, Bernard. So I will try to be very brief. I will highlight like 3 points quickly. I think there are many existing and emerging technological innovations that actually can really help support adaptation and build resilience in our urban context. For example, like building the solar passive housing, distributed solar energy generation and storage systems, as mentioned by our Indian speaker, and also electric and hydrogen fuel vehicles, etc. But most of these are, sort of mature technologies, but still at a niche stage in many parts of the world and not being mainstream. So it is very important for our cities to work together with their national governments to introduce integrated and coherent policies to encourage the uptake of such innovations, and of course, paying due attention to the context. And another point I would like to emphasize is the innovative integration is also a very important innovation, especially in building infrastructure. For example, how do we integrate the built or sometimes called gray and green and blue infrastructures in cities? I think what is needed here is not really pitching the nature-based solutions versus engineering solutions or the blue-green versus gray. But what do I need is really something I call kaleidoscopic sort of approach that really combines the engineering, ecological, social approaches in planning this urban infrastructure. And I think talking about a concrete example, I think the concept of sponge city is such an example, which is being experimented and implemented in many cities in China in recent years. And it is an idea tried to aiming at reducing the impervious surface in cities, and so that cities can behave more like a sponge rather than just send all the rainfall as a runoff immediately, and to enhance the capacity of the city to absorb and delay this runoff during heavy rainfalls. And it is achieved through engineering solutions, for example, like impervious paving materials for public spaces, and also as well as the blue-green infrastructure, such as increasing the urban green cover or utilizing wetlands or existing water bodies as a buffer zone during a heavy rainfall. And it is sort of large-scale initiative with real investment, but the cost effectiveness performance is several times better than the traditional infrastructure. And the third point I'd like to highlight is when we talk about innovation, there's a tendency that we always focus on technological innovations, but actually policy, governance, social and cultural innovations are equally, if not more important, in the urban context. And in terms of policy and governance innovations, some of our work in Shanghai City, for example, looking at their low carbon transition, we found the importance for innovative practices and sustainability policy experimentation in cities in order to identify a suitable way forward that actually best fits the local context. And I think much of this type of innovation occurs in the global south as well, as they don't really require such a big capital investments to begin with. So I'll stop there and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Shumei. So reminder to all the remaining speakers to be as succinct as possible. And I hand over to Aaron and maybe also look a little bit at the gaps. You have described very much the challenge, the tensions, but what are the gaps that you feel science can plug to help you to overcome the tensions that you've described so well?
Thanks. And I found a lamp. I'm interested in the comments that have been made around transformational governance, and that makes me think of government actors and even non-government actors getting better at letting go of the control of these processes and empowering communities to be actively involved. And because I come from a social science background, that's where my brain went when I talk about, when the question was asked, what about science? And I'll give mitigation is the best form of adaptation in the long run. But an example here, we've got a very densely populated low-lying community facing a war on many fronts, rising groundwater, coastal erosion, inundation, flooding events, and a political decision-making framework that encourages short-term thinking. And that's a And so that means over time we've put band-aid fixes on big problems. We're also not very good at going to where people are. We wait in our office for people to come and participate in processes that suit us. And that's a dangerous combination. At the moment, though, we're now working on an adaptation plan with that community, which we're working up from a set of shared values with that community, going back to the very beginning and talking about what is important and special about the place in which these people live, and what are the things that we need to make sure that we can maintain in whatever form in the longer term. And then building up a range of interventions on different timescales that are informed by that. And we're not holding public meetings to discuss this. We're working with every church group, every sports club, every book club, every community organization, whoever is in that neighborhood, and sending people to talk to them at their regular meetings in environments where those people feel more safe and more comfortable. And I think this means we're getting a far broader understanding of concerns and aspirations in those impacted communities, connecting over shared values, informing what will be significant investment decisions, to put a blunt term on it, in terms of both soft and hard infrastructure. And I was interested in and again, I made this point earlier, but similarly, talking about how do we accelerate action, and sometimes acceleration can be counterintuitive. This is absolutely not the fastest way that we could go about having these discussions and making these decisions, but it means that they should be, the depth of understanding we get from this should mean that we get more robust decisions. And so I think, and the point was made about communication, which is a challenge in climate action, because human beings don't, generally speaking, deal very well in abstraction, and climate change and IPCC reports are nothing if not abstract. And so, one of the biggest things that science can offer, and in particular social science can offer, is supporting whether it's subnational governments or local governments or community groups in helping translate what is going on in a way that makes sense to people and is tangible and real to people, without scaring them. And I understand that can be a fine line too, but that communication gap, if you like, is a significant issue for us in terms of how we can get people on board. And again, it's partly an issue of means, and that, if you're focused on paying rent or eating next week, then you're less likely to have the oxygen in your day-to-day life to think about what your neighborhood or your landscape might look like in 30, 50, 80, 100 years time. But we need those voices to be a part of the picture that we're working up together, and that is the kind of thing that I think would be really helpful.
Great, thanks. And maybe Jess, you want to also pick up on that. You've very much stressed in your early intervention how important it is to take people along to ensure that adaptation really works. But maybe from what you've heard, are there any points that you've picked up what can really help in terms of the science contribution for local policymakers to make a difference and to maybe go a little bit faster to scale?
Yeah, I mean, one of the best examples, I suppose, that we've got of an adaptation strategy, which Kathy is very familiar with, was really brought about by, and picking up on Aaron's point, is around urban tree canopy and urban greening. And I think sometimes, if we're talking about climate and communicating it, it can be really valuable to have a kind of Trojan horse issue, whether that, as Xu Bei said, in China, whether it's talking about sponge cities as an entry point, or in the example of Melbourne in Australia, the impact of the drought and heat on our urban green spaces is something that people really understand, because they can feel it, they can see it, sometimes they can smell it, they can touch it. And so a really successful adaptation approach that leans on that concept has been what's called the Which Plant Where database. And that was very much came about through a research collaboration that included local government, state government, the academic sector, and industry to understand what kinds of plants do we need and trees do we need to be planting now to withstand the future climate scenarios that are coming our way. So more of those types of applied research collaborations would be very welcome. And I think also the other thing that would be of great value is to really dissect and rethink and engage with conversations with economists and people who decide how major infrastructure decisions are made. And again, as Shumei said before, we have blue-green grid, we have hard infrastructure. It needn't be a competition, but it would be very valuable to start thinking about major infrastructure investment and major capital investment in terms of how it can support living infrastructure, which is anything that is conducive to life. So clean air, clean water, culture, adaptation measures like that. They still now appear to be a bit of a tack on in terms of government priorities. And if those priorities aren't being made and those pathways are not identified within a treasury model, then they just don't happen. There isn't that, unfortunately, that trickle down effect, and we're not getting the impact at scale.
Great, thank you very much. Mitali, maybe very briefly, can you give us a little bit of a sense? We've been working a lot on gender and social inclusion as well. Can you maybe also talk on the innovations that are needed from the private sector to interlink social inclusion and adaptation, as we have heard, of course, from many of the speakers?
Thanks. Thank you so much, Bernard. And, I'm really glad that we're talking about gender today, because in most of our infrastructure design, especially when we talk about urban design and urban planning, historically, cities are always designed to, look at the needs of cisgender men. And unfortunately, we have not had as much research into the needs of women when they're using cities, whether it's on the mobility front, whether it's about the safety, of reclaiming the rights to a city. And as we move towards, an era where climate disasters become more common, where, the food systems and agricultural production are threatened, which most women rely on. 70% of women in rural India actually rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. And a lot of women, of course, spend time across the world in India and sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America, fetching fuel and water for their families, and are entirely dependent on natural resources. So in such a situation, when women's health and education and livelihoods are disproportionately threatened, the question then for us as private sector and public sector becomes, how do we create solutions and systems that put women front and center and leverage their community leadership to drive adaptation? So one example here, that I'd love to share today is around the Clean Cook Stoves initiative, which I'm sure a lot of you may have heard of, because Hillary Clinton actually was one of the ambassadors of this initiative, where in a lot of developing countries, but particularly so in India, you have a system of cooking which is hazardous to the health of the woman, because she, sort of uses her mouth to, cook on a coal-fired cook stove. But this is also environmentally hazardous, because the firewood for this is taken from the nearby trees and the settlement, and it also releases a large amount of carbon emissions as opposed to a clean cook stove. And through the decades, over the last few decades, when this initially started, a lot of the technology is available. And the cook stoves were brought into many of the villages and towns across India, but the adaptation to that was very low, and people were not purchasing. But the minute the cook stove design was upgraded and women and community groups, self-help groups, were brought in to actually sell these cook stoves, the uptake increased. So we can see that if women are placed front and center in the design of the adaptation and in the uptake of the adaptation, in the communication strategy, we can actually design a gender-sensitive adaptation approach. And that's what we need going forward, because women are disproportionately impacted by climate change.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Tali. And with that, I would like to circle back to Undersecretary Pinto. I know we are beyond time a little bit, but I think it'd be great to hear from you from the national government perspective, where you see the biggest opportunities for urban resilience innovations that national governments can stimulate and move forward.
Thank you, Bernard. As a national government agency, the department consider our local government units as partners. When we say local government units, we refer to our municipalities, cities, and even the provinces. This is where we see the biggest opportunities for urban resilience innovation are. Through our guidance and technical support, we can strengthen their capacities in crafting adaptation strategies and packaging climate resilient projects incorporated through their comprehensive land use plans, and in improving their disaster and their climate and disaster risk assessment tool to further aid them in crafting climate actions that will also promote urban plans and designs that reduce health hazards and adapt it to further future emergencies. Then further, we can go beyond crafting such that we can even provide support in the implementation as well as in monitoring and evaluation of innovations for urban resilience. So that would be all. Thank you, Bernard.
All right. Thank you very much, Undersecretary Pinto and all of the panelists. And I am pleased to hand back to Kathy now to wrap up the session. Over to you.
Oh, well, thank you, Bernard. Luckily, our stellar panel and you, Bernard, my co-host, provided a thorough review and refresh and summary, actually, of this excellent panel, and that the refresh of our knowledge and gaps in not only innovation, but also opportunities for greater integration of city climate adaptation and resilience activities as we respond to climate change was really, really amazing examples. So I feel like we've definitely reviewed and refreshed and covered this global research action agenda key topic of adaptation and resilience well. So I thank our speakers very much so. We are running into time, or we've run out of time, unfortunately, and so I'm going to actually hand over to our conference MC to close our session officially and let you know where to continue the conversation and where to find more about our conference. So over to you, Maddie.
Thanks, Kathy and Bernard. What a fantastic panel. And thank you to our conference illustrator, and I hope that we'll be able to view that wonderful illustration later on. Everybody enjoy the rest of the conference, and remember that any session that you can't get to, you're able to view it later on, immediately after the sessions are finished on the instant replay. And do take the time to see the cinema space for virtual field trips and other pre-recorded sessions. Please also provide your song to our wonderful Spotify playlist and your thoughts on the conference themes in a survey and Padlet boards in the Knowledge Centre. I hope you enjoy the next live space, and our parallel sessions will be starting in about 30 minutes. And I hope to see you there or at another one of our wonderful plenaries. And remember, if you have any technical questions, please head to the Help Centre. Thanks, everybody.